Hi, folks. Trisha Curtis, CEO of PetroNerds and host of the PetroNerds podcast. Welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 112 of the PetroNerds podcast, and I am super pumped to give you a very short intro for a long-awaited podcast. You've probably seen the post on LinkedIn, but this is the AAPL, the American Association of Petroleum Landmen. I still call it Petroleum. Apparently, it's professional. It's the AAPL conference. I was the keynote speaker on Friday, June 21st in Boston. Super awesome conference, great attendance especially on a Friday afternoon. But this is a complete round the world tour on everything you need to know for the U.S. economy, the global economy, oil prices, geopolitics, politics, you name it, it's absolutely covered. So I'll put the details in the show notes, but I can't wait to hear the feedback. Really look forward to you guys listening to this. But with that, to just put a timestamp on this, that podcast that recording for that keynote address was done on June 21st, 2024. So basically a month ago. Today is Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, Harry Potter's birthday. Happy birthday. And that's PetroNerdy for you. So it is July 31st, 2024. If we want to compare the prices from when I gave that presentation and that talk in June versus today, we've seen some erosion in prices. Now, we've seen volatility. On June 21st, prices were $80.73. Today, they're $78.54, but I just saw $74 yesterday. So $74 oil. I mean, this is really important to think about in the context of the incredible geopolitical volatility that we're having. And I think you're not hearing as much about the geopolitics because things like the Fed and Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve who spoke today, that's really weighing on the market more than anything. So you're hearing about the Fed and you're obviously inundated with politics. So the last few weeks, which I know we have not talked about it yet because we've had pre-recordings, I will get into U.S. politics and what that means for energy. But you've had with assassination attempts on former President Donald Trump, with President Biden dropping out of the election race 2 weekends ago, all of that, and then Kamala Harris now in the race, and all this politics and the Fed are really, I think, weighing on the news more than you're hearing geopolitics. So, and then you think about $74 oil that we just saw, and now 78. $74 oil is really telling you that there's some real weakness within the economy. So we know that there's weakness in the U.S. consumer. You're going to hear that a lot within this podcast today of really what inflation is doing, and it's eroding the U.S. consumer. And so I think it's less about what the Fed has done in raising interest rates, more about the Fed not doing enough to actually curb inflation and the consumer being tapped and the consumer pushing back. And so Jerome Powell spoke today. My nieces were watching it with me. I have them here for a couple days. And it's funny because they said, what is he saying? And I thought that was hilarious because it's really not super clear. So we had the Fed minutes, or we had the Fed statement come out, and that was one thing. And then we heard the Fed talk. And Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, did not raise interest rates today, he did not lower interest rates today. There is an expectation and a talk, and he actually talked about it in his minutes today or his briefing, that they're going to lower rates in September. So whether or not they do, I mean, it looks like they're signaling that they're doing that. But the fact that they signaled and said they would do it and they didn't do it this time, it's just extremely messy. And essentially the market's going ahead of them. So there's question marks into why they're not doing it. I think it's great that they're not doing it yet. And apparently that's the argument that they're making the hawks happy because within the Fed, because they haven't lowered them yet. And they're making the doves happy because they're signaling that they are doing it. The reason, there's a lot of question marks on oil prices right now is that you have incredible geopolitical angst and war volatility. So Lebanon is where when we talk about the three H's, where I've talked about Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. One, we have this ongoing war between Gaza or within Gaza with Israel and Hamas, with Hamas attacking Israel on October 7th, 2023. That's been ongoing for months. We continue to see, we have not yet had a ceasefire or an agreement. We continue to see ships being attacked within the Red Sea. I point this out because you're not hearing in the news, but those ships still being attacked are helping keep prices of oil elevated. And they're also keeping shipping container costs elevated, which pressures up goods prices, which prevents the inflation from really being lowered substantially. And it does add reinflationary risks. oil prices propping up also are reinflationary risks. So what we've seen as of late is that Lebanon, within Lebanon, which is where Hezbollah is at, one of the three H's, another terrorist group backed by Iran. So Hezbollah is on Lebanon, that's backed by Iran. Hamas is in that's the Palestinian group that is backed by Iran, and then you have the Houthis within Yemen who are doing all the Red Sea ship attacks, and that's also backed by Iran. So you've had this attack from Hezbollah within the Golan Heights within Israel. Children were killed. This is devastating. Now, Israel is retaliating, so you have the ongoing. So now that's been something you haven't probably heard about, but it has been ongoing. Basically, Hezbollah said they were in cahoots with Hamas, and they, had sympathy with them since the war started on October 7th, and essentially they have been attacking them, but these have escalated and ramped up. And if you've noticed, every time things kind of quiet down, that's when these groups ramp it up because they don't want things to quiet down. They don't want this to end. So it's very, very difficult for all these peace-loving folks. And I know everybody wants peace, but every time this tries to get reasserted, the hardliners within Iran make sure that doesn't happen. And that's certainly what you're seeing. In addition to that, Israel actually managed to get the leader of Hamas. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. One of the senior leaders of Hamas, who, shockingly, apparently he's not associated with Iran, but he was in Tehran, which I just clarifying for folks. These groups are backed by Iran. They get their money from Iran. They're Iranian-backed terrorist groups. So the leader of Hamas was in Tehran, and Israel managed to assassinate him. So he's gone. Well, of course, Iran, in quotation marks, is going to retaliate against Israel. So the point is, this is very, very escalatory. You can see how this is not going away anytime soon. And this should push prices up from just a sheer geopolitical risk standpoint. We need to point out that nothing's really happening in terms of supply. So in the U.S. data, it hasn't come out yet for U.S. production, but I'm assuming it's going to be around 13.3 million barrels per day. But we're not seeing anything being hit on supply. That's partly why you've been seeing, whenever you see the bad economic news, you're seeing these pressures on oil prices. And then today we had this $4 swing up from $74 to $78. So a lot going on within that arena that I've squished into this introduction. But I hope that is helpful in the context of everything that's happening right now. So with that, I hope you guys listen to the latest podcast before this one. If you have not listened to Tad True and Andy Black on the previous podcast, episode 111, it's a really, really awesome conversation for all you guys wanting to talk about upstream and midstream. This is the podcast for you. They are great guests, and they basically inundate me with a ton of questions. I apologize for the lack of videos and podcasts. Summer months, I've got my nieces, which I prioritize, and I'm really excited to see my family. But we will be back in gear, and we will have some special stuff for you coming down the pipeline in August. So this is the long-awaited podcast. This is the keynote address, and the next one is going to be the presentation that I gave in New Mexico, also keynote address, which was super, super fun. So can't wait for this. Can't wait for the feedback. Talk to you soon, folks. Bye. Awesome. Well, I am really pumped to be with you guys today. I know I'm competing with either you flying out or hitting traffic or a Celtics parade, which I didn't know about until I got here. So that's all exciting. I am really, really thrilled to be with you here today. I know I'm the last keynote, so it's just, I am pumped. So we're gonna go through a lot. If you know about PetroNerds or you know the work that I cover, you'll be a little bit familiar with the style, but as a keynote, I'm gonna have some fun with this, and we're gonna cover a lot of intel in a short period of time. And then we'll open it up for questions, and you guys can have free consulting and ask me whatever you like. So firstly, I just want to start out with, we're basically going to give it a lay of the land. And if you haven't listened to the podcast, please do. I'll try to turn this into a podcast as well. But if you haven't tuned in, the one that just dropped today, I literally spent 50 minutes just talking about the U.S. consumer and the health of the economy. It is an absolute deep dive, and trust me, you're going to like it. So tune in. Okay, so the big major takeaways and themes, I'm going to front load this with all the answers, and then we will get into the nerdy slides and the cool pictures, and we'll keep you guys awake and alert for the rest of the afternoon. So oil price drivers. We've had oil prices kind of moving around, dipping into the 70s, popping it back up above 80, and really there's a lot of questions and concerns for a lot of folks probably in the room on what is driving prices up
and what is driving prices down. And I like to talk about this on the push and pull on oil prices. And really what you have is you have a lot of geopolitical factors, which we will spend a lot of time on, that are driving prices up or keeping a floor on prices. And you've got this geopolitical risk premium that we hadn't had probably for 20 years. Now we really have a hearty geopolitical risk premium in the market, but that matters a lot. Because if that geopolitical risk premium is $10, $15, or $20, that means your actual price of oil might be much less. So your wars and that geopolitical risk premium are propping up prices. Your spare capacity, the fact that Saudi Arabia is only producing 9 million barrels per day, means that we have a lot of spare capacity, not just in Saudi Arabia, but within OPEC and the Middle East more broadly. And we also have the US producing 13.2 million barrels per day, more than any country in the world ever. And so we have a lot of production on the market. We also have a looming election in the US, which some people want to talk about, some people don't want to talk about it. It matters a whole lot for this industry. It matters for all businesses. But when we think about the election and just simply oil prices, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the Biden administration has tapped that a lot and drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but the expectation is they absolutely will again, especially before the election, in order to get prices down. And there's a lot of other things that they're looking to do that as well. So with all those, you have pushes up and pulls down. Now, consumer sentiment is a very big deal, and the deceleration of the global economy. And here's where you might be thinking, she's going to tell us a lot of negative things about the economy. I am. And I'm going to tell you a lot of bad things about the world, a lot of bad things about the economy, and you're going to go, holy crap, this is not good. But I'm going to end this on how awesome U.S. shale is and talking about the resiliency in U.S. shale and why you guys in your business, why it matters so much, and why it is very, very investable. This all being said, the industry has to do more to make it better. But the health of the consumer is not great. We are seeing real deterioration in U.S. consumer health. We're seeing that a deceleration in the entire global economy. So if you were looking for oil demand to go up and that to drive oil prices up, it is not happening. There's nowhere in this world where I can point to an area and say the economy looks good and that's going to drive oil up. Maybe a little bit in India, but really not anywhere else. So we have to think about this. I call it the non-recession recession. We're basically in recession. At least half of America is in recession. If you were living paycheck to paycheck, you were in recession. And why this is so unique and why this matters is because we've had inflation that has lasted for the better part of almost 4 years now, but we've had inflation, significant inflation in 2021, 2022, 2023. We're in 2024. We still have inflation. And yeah, headline inflation is 3.3%, but that's on top of massive inflation we've already had. Inflation doesn't go away. It's just the rate of price increases on top of those other increases. Today, I heard on CNBC this morning, if you are not making 26% more money than you were in 2020, you are not making more money because inflation has just eroded it. And if you go to the grocery store, you're paying about 40% more than you were in 2019. So if you want to know why there's a disconnect from what you hear on TV, see in the stock market, everybody rah-rahing and they want lower interest rates, and you see the Biden administration getting on TV constantly and saying, oh my gosh, we've added all these jobs and things are great, but then consumer sentiment comes out and it's crap. This is why. When people are paying a lot more, they don't feel good, and they're paying a lot more for everything, from housing to electricity to fuel to bills, to pay for their utility bills, more across the board. And you can't underscore enough. Inflation is an economy killer, and it matters a whole lot in the U.S. economy because we consume 20 million barrels a day, or roughly 20% of global oil demand. Now, we also have very high electricity prices, and in the context of EVs, this matters a lot. I think a lot of people got this wrong, thinking that we were going to have an acceleration of EVs because we would have high oil prices and people would pivot over. What those people got wrong was that high electricity prices are actually killing electric vehicle adoption. In addition to the fact that when you try to resell an electric vehicle, you can't get any money on it. And so Hertz actually lost a crap ton of money on this, and they lost their CEO because of this, because of the resale of electric vehicles. And it was they had to move away from it. If you've rented a vehicle for business, you really don't want an electric vehicle because you have to charge that up and it's very complicated. It really is not a good business model. And so it actually hurt Hertz quite a bit. But then we have this, so we have these rising electricity prices, especially in Colorado, we're seeing them, and you're hurting this EV adoption. But we also have electricity demand and AI. And so when people are talking about AI, you hear a lot of, I know that it's been talked about within this conference, everybody's talking about it, very few people really understand what it is, but it is an energy hog. So when you're asking, you're sending information out or asking a computation to come out, it goes into the cloud, it comes back, all these data centers are hogging up a lot of energy. So if we want to be competitive, if in the US we want to have our own data centers, or if in Colorado, or if in Massachusetts or anywhere you want to have a data center, guess what? You are not powering it with wind and solar. You are powering it with natural gas. Almost every AI facility has natural gas right now, and they are backed up by, I will say it, diesel generators, which is oil. So the demand for traditional fuels, crude oil, natural gas, and coal is really high. It is not going away. And that's why I call this the non-transition energy transition, because it's really just energy. We're not really transitioning, and you'll see that in the data as well. So all this geopolitical uncertainty and volatility, it's massive. People are calling this the reemergence of geopolitics. It's not really a reemergence. It's basically just geopolitics. I mean, in many ways, it's rearing its ugly head, but really it's war on top of war. So we have multiple hot wars, and the fact that we're all kind of sitting here, we're eating, and it's calm, and we've got this recession going on, and people are going about their business, there's a lot happening in the world, and that's what keeps a lot of folks up at night. That's what keeps me up at night when I do all this geopolitical work and other work that I do for clients, is that the fact that you have a war, an ongoing war in Ukraine with no end in sight, and you have this war in the Middle East, and you have, the volatility in the Middle East is huge. Every time that the US tries to pacify Iran or tries to make things better, Iran just pushes back and says, no, the hardliners, they don't want to pacify anyone. So now we're seeing acceleration in the north of Israel with Hezbollah. We see the Houthis continuing to attack ships within the Red Sea. You didn't hear about that for a while because it kind of was downplayed. The ships have continued to be attacked in the Red Sea from November to now. And what that has done is it's made ships have to go around the Horn of Africa instead of going through the Suez Canal, put several, it's basically double the time that they have to move stuff. So what that does is it increases tanker costs, it increases fuel costs, it increases oil prices, and it increases goods costs. Something Jerome Powell mentioned in the Fed statement in his commentary just a couple weeks ago was the fact that we were seeing an uptick in goods prices when they had seen a deceleration. And part of that is because of these Red Sea attacks. So all that is inflationary and all that is very bad for the long term for the economy and in turn oil prices. And then you have this little confluence of group of actors like Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran that are increasingly very cozy. And you hear that, people saying they're very cozy, and then if you listen to analysts, they kind of play lip service to it and they say, that's not a good marriage, that's not a good relationship, these people don't really like each other, it's never gonna work out. Well, I don't care if the marriage works out or not. It's going to cause us a whole lot of pain as long as they hang out together. And they're all hanging out together. And Putin just visited North Korea. North Korea, Kim Jong-un has went up to, several months ago, has went up to Russia. This is only the second time that Putin has visited North Korea in 24 years. And so they're reaffirming this. This is a hugely beneficial relationship for North Korea because North Korea has been under sanctions for a very long time. They are desperate for anything they can get. So Russia's providing them a lifeline. China's providing Russia a lifeline with all the stuff that China's buying, crude oil, and they're buying coal, and they're buying grain, and they're giving Russia a massive lifeline of money. And China's also giving Iran this nice lifeline because Iran is under sanctions, but China's buying 2 million barrels a day of crude from them. So you can see how they are all kind of working nicely together, and they're wreaking havoc in very, very cheap and effective ways on the Western world. So these Houthi attacks, these attacks in the Red Sea, those are being done. Right now, they just did one with drones. They're very effective means, and they get to say it's a non-state actor, so it's not technically Iran. It's definitely Iran, but it poses a lot of risk for things going forward. And then we have this European political shift where we've had not dissimilar from what we've seen across the world, but basically when you go too hard in one direction, you almost always have a flip. And what has happened in Europe is that you're seeing the right wing, they call it the right wing, is moving. It's not just as simple as it sounds, where it's right-wing craziness and fascists. There are a lot of people within Europe that basically have been inundated with very restrictive, very heavy, progressive policies, very socialist agendas, and really expensive policies. So what you've seen, if people were paying attention to this in Paris, where you saw farmers in their tractors driving them through Paris and saying, hey, we have very, very high fuel costs, we have very, very high regulations, and we just want to do business. And this matters a whole lot in Europe when you have a war going on and people actually are concerned about food security and making sure they can produce their own grain. So it's not as simple as just saying that's right wing or that's left wing. It's what's going on the ground. And the burdensome overregulation is something you hear in America a lot. If you were to poll CEOs, and I've been with them in and outside the oil and gas industry, one of the single biggest things they will say in the last several years has been overregulation, too much red tape. And that's what you actually hear. The International Monetary Fund is saying that Germany has too much red tape and that Germany can't grow their economy because they have too much red tape. When you have entities like the IMF of all entities saying that, that means you have too much damn red tape. So regulations do not help business. And the problem is, I know we need them and you have to be smart about them, but you just can't add regulations and add regulations and add government spending on top of government spending, because you get into the situation where we're in, where you have inflation and you have things that are strapped and it's not business friendly, and that actually impacts your economy. And that's absolutely what we see in Europe. Yes, people want to go to Europe and they want to drink nice wine, but they don't want to start a business in Europe. And if we're not careful in the US, that is where we're going. Now, the US election has significant implications. It really implications probably for the single, like direct implications for the oil and gas industry. It couldn't be more stark. I mean, you can go down a track of another 4 years of what we have, which is going to be very painful for the oil and gas industry, or you can have a less regulatory one. And that's how it is. People are very uncomfortable talking about politics. I think you really need to, from a simple regulatory standpoint of what the industry will look like, oil and gas and all subsegments. So there's a lot of things going on with that right now. China, the economic health of China is beyond serious. It is a deteriorating economy that's really messy, but it was never as healthy as people thought. It was never the 20% GDP growth that people thought of China. That was very, very messy, very ad hoc, and a lot of it was fake. And a lot of it was funded by the West, right? Us pummeling money into China, putting lots of money into China, and then saying, oh my gosh, the market's so big, you'll eventually make money. Nobody actually made any money. Nobody made any profits. So now it's kind of deteriorating, it's falling apart, and there's a lot of debt within China. That's a massive risk globally for the economy, and it's a risk globally on the geopolitical side, because the geopolitical side has been ongoing even with the economic stuff, whether they grow economically or decline. There's massive geopolitical risk, and that's largely because China is not our friend, and I'm talking about the Chinese government. They don't want to continue to do business with us. They want to continue to do business to the extent that it benefits them. If it doesn't benefit them, they don't want to do it. And so that means that all the stuff with North Korea, all the stuff with Iran, all the stuff with Russia, that's not benefiting the West, that's not benefiting us. It is benefiting China. So if you don't think the geopolitical risks are growing there, we have these ongoing hot wars that are nearly completely funded by China. So the risk is growing, and it bodes very poorly for the global context of geopolitical risk. And then the CO2 piece is very, very important, because if you think CO2 emissions are the number one thing that people should be focusing on, it really does not make sense to be attacking traditional fuel infrastructure in America. And I say this like shutting down natural gas-fired power plants or shutting down coal-fired power plants, when you're basically just relegating that production to China, because China is producing the wind turbines, the batteries, the EVs, and all the solar panels, and they're doing that with traditional fuels like coal and forced labor, and that is how they compete. So that is a big risk going forward as well. So with all that, you have all these black swans, and you have these, the straw that could break the camel's back, and sort of these undercurrents in the economy and this risk. And lastly, which I'll cover, is the resiliency in U.S. shale. We have incredible resiliency in this market, despite all the headwinds. And actually, one of the single biggest things keeping up the U.S. economy is U.S. shale. The fact that we produce 13.2 million barrels a day means we import a lot less crude oil. We also export 4 million barrels a day of crude oil. We export a lot of product. We're the largest oil producer in the entire world, and we're the largest exporter of crude and product combined in the entire world. So that is helping our economy significantly, and is also providing jobs. But we have very, very poor market coverage of oil and gas. We have a lack of understanding in this country and in the world and in this industry on actually oil and gas and how critical it is. And we have a very anti-domestic oil and gas administration. We have never in history had an American administration that was against American oil and gas in this way. And we absolutely have one. And if you want to know what it's going to look like, if you have another 4 years, it's not going to look any better, because they're not fans of this. They're not fans of domestic oil and gas production. They're working really, really hard right now with Saudi Arabia to throw some barrels on the market to lower prices before the election. And then, truthfully, we really do have a lack of leadership in oil and gas. We need more folks in oil and gas talking about what they do, not just because we want to rah-rah the industry, but because in order to do business, you have to have people like me, you have to have voices in the market talking about oil and gas and how it fits into the global economy. If you don't have that, if you're a public oil and gas company and you're not getting up in your earnings call and explaining that, how can you expect the market to invest in your company? How can you expect the market to understand how you fit in, not just right now in the economy, but how you fit in the economy 10, 20, and 30 years from now? Okay, so your black swans, we've already talked about this, but I think you have probably more black swans than you actually do white ones. So people say, what is the thing that could break the camel's back? And I'm not saying we're going to go into a 2008 style recession and this is what's going on or we're going to have a crisis. But the problem is the way people look at the market, the way they're looking at the economy, they're looking for that 2008 style recession. They're looking for that straw that's going to break the camel's back. And the reality is, it's usually not the consumer. It's typically not the consumer that just stops spending, and then that's what happens. However, in this recession, it could be the U.S. consumer that leads it, because what we're having is a consumer that's hit so hard with inflation and they're no longer healthy that they could really slow down their spending. And then businesses will start looking and saying, okay, well, I'm Lululemon, I don't know if my sales are going to be good, and then I start cutting people. And when people start cutting staff and you start cutting jobs, it actually tends to happen very, very rapidly. So that's why when you're listening to the Federal Reserve and you're listening to those speeches, you have to be very careful about looking at what they're really saying. And if the Fed starts cutting rates, it is probably not because we are in a good place. And the fact that the European Central Bank and other central banks are cutting rates, it isn't because they're good, it's because they're actually declining and they need to cut rates. So the health of the US consumer is really, really serious. It is not nearly as good as people think it is, and that is definitely a black swan. War escalation, any continuing escalation with Ukraine, with Russia, between Iran, Israel, any ramping up of that, any more things in the Red Sea, that's another black swan. Venezuela, if Venezuela decides that they really want to go after Guyana. North Korea, if that relationship with Russia ramps up, if they decide that they want to do more, if Russia says, we'll back you up, if you want to throw some missiles down at South Korea, that'd be great. That's a problem. Any further deterioration in the Chinese economy, which we sort of expect, but ramping up how they're ramping up their engagement with Russia. If they pull in Russia for regional efforts like Taiwan or the Philippines, that's going to be very problematic. Taiwan is definitely an ongoing potential blockade problem, but the Philippines right now is really front and center. If you're paying attention to the news, it is really all about the Philippines right now, and this vessel, basically this old ship that's run aground, that the Philippines are just trying to keep people there with food and fuel and keep them alive, because if they're not on that ship that's run aground, then the Chinese will essentially take it over, and that's basically what's at play now. It sounds really simple. It's basically that could turn into an escalatory war situation pretty quickly. And then just overall inflation. I will bang it home over and over and over and over. Inflation is what kills the consumer, and it is killing the consumer. So wage pressures, government spending, we have a crap ton of government spending. It is partly what is keeping the economy afloat, but it is also why we have so much inflation, is because of government spending. It's also why you see the stock market as high as it is because of government spending. Red Sea attacks, war, oil prices. And then all the thing with the US consumer, and why I think it's really, really important, is you hear the narrative on the news right now is that the Federal Reserve is winning the war on inflation because of higher interest rates. Well, I don't really buy that. And that's because they're winning the war on inflation because we're actually lowering inflation because the consumer is not buying things. And you actually see that within housing data, which I'm going to show you right now, is that we're not, even with high interest rates, we haven't curbed housing price inflation. So oil prices and natural gas prices, this is just a monthly look. The importance of staring at this is, it is important to stare at it for a while and just say, are you comfortable with where oil prices are at? And will you be comfortable at oil prices at 60? The oil industry is making a lot of money right now. We have very, very healthy oil prices. We do not really have healthy gas prices, but if we go up and we're at $3 and change for natural gas, that is pretty healthy. So oil prices at this $80-ish level, it's pretty high for the consumer. But we haven't seen these prices. We had a period of very 50s to 60s range. We didn't really have inflation. And then we also had this big spike in 2008. So when you have this long-term inflation and long-term high oil prices, it isn't a recipe for great things. What you're hearing, though, and the International Energy Agency just came out with their annual 2024 outlook. They said that the world would be peaking oil demand within this decade, and that we were going to lose a lot of gasoline demand. And they point to this. I've been showing this chart forever, but apparently the IEA just got wise, and now you're seeing this chart everywhere. This is the vehicle miles traveled in the US, and that is gasoline demand on the bottom. And so what you see there is that gasoline demand has not recovered to its pre-COVID highs. Our vehicle miles traveled almost have recovered. Our gasoline demand has not. But our gasoline demand is not tanking either. It's just soft. And the reason it's soft is really because of oil prices, and because oil prices spiked. So we had this big ramp up. We shut in the economy, we reopened the economy, and then we had this big ramp up in oil demand, and everybody was driving, and everybody went nuts, and they bought campers and everything, and they just went to town driving. So you had this big spike up, and you see the spike up in gasoline demand, and then it comes off a cliff, or it comes down. And it came down because we had this massive spike in oil prices, and we had corresponding inflation, and the consumer's going, ugh, holy crap. So they just pulled back a little bit. And that is what we're seeing in gasoline demand. I think if you had lower prices, it would be a little healthier. If you have higher prices now, though, you could see this get hit. And then diesel demand, that's your bigger story. That is a bigger problem. If you notice that diesel demand that's on the right, that's dipping a little bit. I do not like that dipping because it corresponds with a lot of data points that I study. I've given you a summary slide deck that I'm going to go through really fast in the next 40 minutes. But I usually have 200 slides for clients, and we parse this out. And that data point of diesel demand correlates with the consumer sentiment, correlates with quarterly earnings declining. It correlates with a lot of things, correlates with truck tonnage, correlates with decline in rail traffic. And that's really the bellwether for your economy. So I do think in some ways, a soft-itioning in oil prices and this diesel demand, it's telling us something. Now, the reason I say that the Fed, interest rates are not high enough. They're 5% and change. You can't go to the bank and get 5% and change to put your money in. And that's the difference between the 1970s. This isn't 1970s inflation. However, it is 1970s style in terms of, look at the stock market. It is just, it's ridiculous. You have all the money in certain areas and certain companies, and it's overly inflated. It doesn't make sense, and yet people are plowing into it. That looked like the 70s, looks like the 1990s, looks like a lot of things. But interest rates haven't cooled off housing prices almost very much at all. So housing prices have come down a smidge, not much, and you've got interest rates at 7%. The problem is no one can afford, 7% is very, very high for a mortgage rate, but that's because also housing prices have not come down. And so if the Fed lowers interest rates tomorrow and you start seeing 4% mortgage rates, then you're never going to see this cooling off in housing. And housing is a huge component of inflation. And it trickles through other sectors. It's not just your home price, it's your rental price, it's your services related to housing. So it gets very messy, very sticky. And I want to say this, not everyone has to own a home. You always hear this on TV of, well, we don't have enough homes out there. We might not have enough homes out there, but we have been building a lot of apartments. And so that's your home ownership rate on the left, that's your price to rent ratio on the right. It is no longer affordable to own a home. It is much cheaper to rent because you're owning a home, you have to pay for your home, but now you have very high electricity bills, now you have very high utility bills, now you have very high insurance, now you have very high everything costs, and it is very, very expensive to own a home. If you look at housing starts, this is all housing starts, including apartments and single family. How it correlates with oil prices, I think, is very interesting because actually housing starts came way off a cliff well before the crisis in 2008. The fact that people didn't see that is a bit crazy, but it was coming off. And then you saw oil prices spike, and then you saw now we built up and we're building all this housing. We came down, and now we're kind of right tracking in line with oil prices. We have a massive amount of debt in like household debt is about $18 trillion. So we're not even talking about government debt. That is $18 trillion. Most of it is mortgage debt. And people say, oh, well, that's okay because a lot of those mortgages are 3% or sub 3%. Well, that's good and that's bad. Because if you bought $1 million home and you and your wife or you and your husband are both making money and you've got double income and you've got $1 million home and you finance that at 3%, awesome. That's really awesome if you both have a job. This works when everybody's employed. This starts getting really messy when people start losing jobs. And why everybody seems like we're kind of on this tenterhooks and are we good, are we bad, is because everybody gets on TV, particularly the Biden administration gets on TV a lot, and they talk about the jobs, we have full employment, everybody should be happy. But that's not what you're seeing. People don't feel happy because they have all this debt. And they're not feeling as good about the job market. They're not feeling like they can move. And you actually can't move because you're locked into your mortgage and you can't get another mortgage, so you can't easily buy another home. So you probably have to rent. So we have some things going on here that's going to be problematic. And then you see the debt levels actually ratcheting up and rising significantly. And that's because you have all this other debt, particularly student loan, credit cards, and auto debt, which is massive, where it's over $5 trillion. This is coming home to roost. And this is one of those black swans that, it's just kind of swimming up. It's right in the water. If you don't see it, it's right here. And then we have government expenditures. So part of the reason why we have this inflation and part of the reason why that 5% interest rates that the Federal Reserve has isn't working is because we have such high government spending. Yeah, it ratcheted up during COVID, came down a little bit, but it's really high. We're spending trillions of dollars, and that's our deficit. That's just our deficit there, which is $1.65 trillion, our deficit. And this is our interest payments alone at the end of 2023 is $1 trillion. Our interest payments on our debt is more than our military spending. This is not a long-term solution, and it's a massive, massive problem. Okay, so if you take away nothing, I call this a money chart. This is like CEO speak. This is like your take home, take away nothing. This is the chart to take away. That green line is oil prices. That purple line is unemployment. The orange line is your inflation, and the black line is your interest rates. So you will notice something very clear, and I've met Jerome Powell, but I would love to just ask him why he cannot read this chart as clearly as I can. What you see is that when the Fed stopped raising interest rates, inflation stopped coming down. It's clear as day. That's it. Interest rates are not high enough. Inflation is not coming down. Inflation got sticky and got stuck there when we stopped raising interest rates. Now, you have these high oil prices, and people say, well, that's a problem. Just note that unemployment is ticking up a little bit. You're starting to see unemployment go up to 4%. That's still not very high. But we've had 2 periods of high oil prices when we did not have high inflation. Now we have high oil prices, and we still have this very sticky inflation. Call it headline inflation, 3.3%. I don't care. I know that you are paying 40% more at the grocery store than you were in 2019, and that is why the consumer feels really crappy. You also have shelter inflation at 5.4%. You've got service inflation still well stuck and sticky, well over 5%. That means everybody's paying more for everything. And electricity prices. I can't bang this home enough either of this takeaway. 5.9% was your inflation rate on electricity prices last month. That is massive. That is not something anyone's talking about because it's not convenient. It doesn't work out for everyone because this is a huge problem. This is historical electricity prices. We are up to 18 cents a kilowatt hour, and it's important to drill this home. So this is our fuel that we're using in our electricity output. So our total power generation by fuel, that's that total line in red. That yellow line is natural gas. Half of our power generation is coming from natural gas. If you are in this business and you know how low natural gas prices have been this year, you should be expecting that your utility bill should be lower, that we should be seeing disinflation or deflation on utility bills, because if half your grid is nat gas and gas prices are that cheap, we should not see rising prices. The problem is we are not. We've seen this dramatic uptick. That's historical electricity prices. We had this whole bout of time where it was 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and the last few years it has jumped up to 18 cents a kilowatt hour, and that is murdering the consumer. If you track that with just wind and solar additions, this is what happens. And I know people might get uncomfortable with this. This is absolute reality. So you add wind and solar into your grid. It's very costly. So when people talk about levelized cost of energy, that's a completely BS metric. It doesn't work with wind and solar. You can buy it cheap because China is making this with coal and forced labor, so we can buy the wind power, we can buy the solar power, we can put it into the grid, but when we put it into the grid, it gets really, really costly, and this is what happens. And you see this actually, this is the JP Morgan report, their annual report, it's awesome. They show a direct correlation with wind and solar penetration in electricity prices in homes in Europe. So it happened in Europe, it's happening here, and it is the single best thing. We have this country where we have a crap ton of natural gas, and we had very, very low electricity prices, which is very, very good for businesses. It's good for AI, it's good to make robotics, it's good for everything, and it's good for households. We become less competitive when our energy prices go up. You want to raise electricity prices? Keep adding crappy wind and solar into your grid and see what happens. This is what is happening. And then you have places in Colorado where they just keep adding it, where Xcel is adding more, and they're saying, well, we're going to pay for the renewables, so we're going to increase your price of natural gas, and we're going to get rid of natural gas, we're going to pay for those renewables. They have not worked out how this is going to work out, but they're making us pay a lot for it. And I don't hear the Biden administration getting mad at Xcel and the CEO of Xcel that's making over $20 million a year. I don't see him writing letters like he did to Exxon and Chevron, yelling at these companies saying, pass along the cost savings to the consumer, which isn't how it works between production and refining. But you don't hear this in utilities, and utilities are look at the stock market, they're making bank right now because they're passing on all these costs to the consumer, which is just horrible and wrong. And then AI, again, we talk a lot about it, people talk about it. It is poised to, the demand for energy is going to be huge from artificial intelligence in lots of different ways. But the point is, it is not going to come from wind and solar. No tech giant is sitting around a table right now saying, I have got to figure out how to get more wind and solar to power that AI facility. Yeah, they might, just because they're trying to pacify someone, but right now they're all powered with natural gas, with the diesel power backup, because they cannot afford for it to go down. And so when we look about this in the US, and if it's about CO2 emissions, that's our CO2 emissions. That's our power generation. So you can see that when natural gas went up and when coal went down, that's when our CO2 emissions went down. Is the single simplest, easiest way, if you were about lowering CO2 emissions, you should be about more natural gas. And the fact that we are not and the world is not means it's probably not about lowering CO2 emissions. So if you go to the White House webpage, and I encourage you to do so, you'll see this on clean energy. There's a lot of talk right now from the Biden administration because it's an election time. So everybody's pumping everything and, you know, telling the consumer that they're doing great, telling them that they don't have inflation, telling them that they're lowering their bills. That's being said. It's not really happening. But I point this out because if you look at this, and I think it's the most hilarious image. It's on the front of the website page or the White House webpage. It's their clean energy. That's, you know, solar panels, which are coming from China. And that's a white piece of paper. There's nothing on that. They're staring at that like, oh my gosh, look at that. There's nothing on that white piece of paper, which is case in point of what this Biden administration has done on energy, which is a whole lot of nothing. So then you have the White House record. Again, straight from the White House, this is all I'm telling you. This is the White House record. This is what they have for the record, is saying lowering costs for families' everyday expenses through the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act is a massive multi-trillion-dollar spending bill. I have a newsflash for the government. When you spend money, it is not disinflationary. It is inflationary. And we are spending crap tons of money. If you go through that Inflation Reduction Act, all of it is spending. It is spending on subsidies here and subsidies there and giving this farmer subsidies. And it's insane. So it's very inherently inflationary. And this is showing up finally in the data. You hear about the resilient consumer, the resilient consumer. Well, the consumer is no longer resilient. And we heard it in the last quarter of earnings calls from McDonald's to Starbucks to Lululemon. Everyone said that they're getting hit by inflation and the consumer is pushing back. You see it in the consumer sentiment survey. This is the consumer economic conditions, how the consumer feels about the current economic environment. It tanked 10% month over month. If you look at it, it's not as low as it was in the height of inflation in 2022, but it's very, very low. And from a historical standpoint, it's as low as it's ever been. The consumer sentiment took a nice little nosedive or increasing nosedive unexpectedly from May to June. And then the historical consumer sentiment, we are back where we were in 2008. So it's very, very bad from how people are feeling. And that's because they're not feeling as good about the job market. And part of that is because a lot of the jobs that were added have been in leisure and hospitality. And I have no knock on hardworking people in leisure and hospitality. I think that's wonderful. However, they are not high-paying jobs. They're the people burned the most by inflation, and they're the people, so when they get a wage gain, they lose it all because they have inflation. So when you're adding leisure and hospitality, that is not a healthy, growing economy in high-wage sectors of people making $100,000 a year, which, by the way, the people making over $100,000 a year are the single biggest growing segment at Walmart. And that should also tell you something about the health of the economy. I'm one of those people. I'm trading down and going to Walmart all the time. Okay, so Biden administration, all this is happening. What are they trying to do? They want to lower oil prices. Amos Hutchinson just said this, that we will do everything we can to make sure that America is well supplied enough to ensure as low price as possible for American consumers. That includes tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which they've already done quite a bit. They just started refilling the SPR. So this is something that is a very near-term risk in terms of the oil market between now and the election. You're going to see prices come down, whether they give Saudi Arabia nuclear power, and they cut some kind of deal with Saudi Arabia to add 1 million barrels a day back to the market. The Biden administration, I think they really want to see something like $60 oil. They really want to see prices at the pump come down because that's one of the only things that they can control in terms of inflation and do something very, very quickly. They just started refilling the SPR, so that's our days of cover. So you kind of put a floor, though, on oil prices. So they may do this temporarily. They lower prices. They're not really smart on hydrocarbons, so the odds that they get this wrong and don't get the timing right from when they release the SPR and when it gets to the refinery and then when it gets to the pump, they don't have a lot of time for that. So they're going to have to do things relatively quickly. If they do it too soon, prices could go back up, because if you're selling off the SPR, you kind of are holding a floor because someone is going to have to fill that SPR back up. And I have a problem with this with the industry. There's been a kind of an ebb and flow in terms of how the industry is working with the Biden administration. They're really not working with the Biden administration because since day one in office, We had canceling of Keystone XL. We had the climate change executive orders within the 7th day in office. We had a complete ban. I don't know if people remember this, but they need to remember it. There was a ban of permitting for 60 days on federal land. No permits were approved for the first 60 days of the Biden administration. It was a political move. They were trying to get people appointed in office, but that was by the acting Secretary of Interior. It wasn't even the actual Secretary of Interior. That was the first 60 days. That put things on a rocky footing with the oil and gas industry and the Biden administration. And then you had the Biden administration sending actual letters to Exxon and to Chevron, yelling at them for high oil prices. And then you have the Biden administration threatening to do this climate emergency thing. Whether they will do that or not is a question mark. That could happen before the election. And then you've seen a cooling in relations really by folks who are really understanding. One of the big things is that when the Biden administration earlier this year put a pause on permitting for LNG export facilities, I don't think the oil and gas industry took it as seriously as they should. You certainly saw, this was taking place when there was a big Baker Hughes conference in Italy, and there were a lot of folks in the industry in Italy at that time, and that's all they talked about. It took over the entire conversation over there because everyone in the world is planning on liquefied natural gas. Especially for their so-called energy transition, it's all about liquefied natural gas, and the fact that the U.S. had paused or banned permitting in the future means that the rest of the world gets concerned that we are not going to be long-term suppliers of this LNG, which that doesn't matter for the rest of the world because now they're going to Qatar for it. So the implications were really, really big, and they remain to be really, really big. So the global economy, it's not really a good story here either. There's a lot of other data points, but I'm going to try to make this as succinct as possible. You see European manufacturing, it's below 50, it's not great. Global trade is down, global PMI manufacturing is down. If we think about this and what it means for oil demand, European oil demand, that's the orange line. It hasn't been great. It's been on that declining trend anyway. That's German oil demand, been declining as well. But actually last year in 2023, we really saw some deterioration. And Germany is an industrial powerhouse, or at least they used to be. And now this is a big problem with them because they're so tied at the hip with Chinese economy because they sell a lot of autos to China. China sells a lot to them. But as China is dumping electric vehicles on the market, they are really, really hurting Germany. And Germany's in this pickle because they sell a lot to them. And one of the things that we see with China and with all this EV dumping and why it's so serious is that they are kneecapping global auto manufacturers. So yes, it's all about electric vehicles right now, but that's not really what China's after. China's after getting 10 years from now, not having a Ford, not having a GM, not having a BMW that actually exists and are profitable because, I don't know, those companies actually were really relevant and really prevalent for war efforts. And I know people don't want to believe this, but China does not think short term. So it's just an added benefit to dump your EVs, hurt those companies, and then not have those companies around in the future to compete with for any reason. And this is what we see. We actually see China reviving dead companies. So these companies were not profitable to begin with. They're not about profits. Most Chinese companies are not about profits in the first place. These are, so they're reviving mothballed companies completely that were dead, and they're making all these EVs. The world already has too many of them. They're not selling them. So you see Chinese electric vehicles on the market now for as low as $10,000. And that is why you saw Europe come back and they just put tariffs on these EVs. We've put tariffs on these EVs. We don't really get many of them in the US, but the point is if we did, this would be a problem. And so this is part of the whole Chinese entity of just dumping this stuff on the market. This is keeping some of their economy afloat. It's keeping their jobs afloat. It is not a long-term thing. If we stopped buying EVs tomorrow, it's not like China, they care. This is just a short-term thing, and also shows that China's really doubling down on the things that they know. Manufacturing. They are a manufacturing powerhouse. They know how to make these, so they're just going to turn them out and they're going to chuck them on the market. This is basically an old playbook. But China is importing a lot of crude oil. And this is a big problem we have in terms of sort of understanding the market. One of the big misconceptions or question marks is on the macro side. Where's the oil demand coming from? Is China actually consuming 17 million barrels a day, which is what OPEC said last year, which is what the IEA has said last year? And if they're importing, and this is EIA, this is why I show this data, they're importing almost 12 million barrels per day last year. That's a lot of crude oil. So they produced about 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, and they were importing a crap ton. Now, I know from the Chinese economy, from even when the data's crappy, we know that they're declining. We know that their housing sector is in the absolute doldrums. We know that they're really hurting. And housing is a lot. It's probably 30% of the economy. So even if it flatlined, it would slow the global economy. So we know that this data is not real. We know that they're not not consuming 17 million barrels of oil per day, but they are stockpiling it. And so that stockpiling makes sense. It makes sense in the context of, we know they're stockpiling grain, we know they're stockpiling coal, we know they're stockpiling everything. We also know that they're hoarding gold reserves. So China is preparing for sanctions, whether those are secondary sanctions, which is what everybody thinks they're really preparing for, or primary sanctions. They are gearing up. And part of that's because they just want to be insulated, but they could be wanting to be insulated because they're going to be instigating, or they're going to make it look like they're not instigating and they're going to let Russia and North Korea do their dirty work, but they're definitely gearing up for sanctions, and you see that across the data points. But the implications for oil demand are really, really serious, because where is that oil demand? A lot of it's stockpiling. I actually would argue, and I'm not bullish on Chinese oil demand, but the fact that they are on a war footing, and I say war footing in that they're supporting Russia's war effort. So they are making autos, they're making ammunition, they're making a lot of stuff, they're sending all that to Russia for Russia to use in this war. It puts China on a war footing, and there is some components of oil demand that are layered in there, and it's partly why we're seeing their economy probably not fall off a cliff, at least from an oil demand standpoint. So the Chinese economy, that is housing prices, take every data point in China with a massive crap ton of salt, but collectively, when you study this, you can get some information out of it. But their housing prices are declining. They're in bad shape. They have deflation. Cement output, that's a great chart just because you can see it really declining. I think this is great. Again, not concrete, but I think of Chinese GDP growth, and when you think of 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever it is, it's fiction. Not all GDP is created the same, and I like to liken Chinese GDP to they don't have institutions, they don't have rule of law. So you can build, and you can just build a home, and you can do all kinds of stuff, but it's like concrete and rebar, right? If you don't have the rebar, things aren't going to actually stick to it. And the Chinese economy does not have rebar. That is the institutions, that's the rule of law, that's what we have. They do not have it. Their exports, though, of wind, solar, and batteries are huge. And this is really we are all buying into this like crazy. So we're saying, oh my gosh, we got to do the energy transition, sign me up, let me go. And we're buying this all from China. And they went from less than $2 billion in exports to over $14 billion in exports of just EVs, batteries, and solar. That is all made from coal, that is all made from forced labor, and it's made in dirty and improper means. And the fact that we're applauding ourselves from an ESG standpoint for doing this is absolutely insane. And the chickens come home to roost with all this, because that cannot last, especially if you're at a war with them directly or indirectly. The gold reserves, you can see this massive uptick in 2024. That's alarming. Their foreign exchange reserves have sort of flatlined. The gold reserves, it's essentially, they're trading. If Russia and China and Iran, North Korea are all trading with each other, they're going to keep themselves insulated. That's what the gold story is about. So, summarizing this in some ways for geopolitics. So you've got this, you can't underscore the role of infrastructure and power enough. We've seen Russia early on in early part of this year, they were really heavily attacking Ukrainian power infrastructure. They were doing that in the early part of the war, but they re-upped it because, the fact that Ukraine wasn't getting enough money, they weren't defending, didn't have perfect defense. So they were defending a lot, right? They could intercept these missiles and they wouldn't always hit. But if some of the missiles hit, they hit infrastructure, and so it can easily decimate. If a handful of those missiles hit, they basically are decimating infrastructure. And the reason Russia was going after Ukrainian Ukraine does not have much power infrastructure to begin with, but what they do have, they're making things with. And so the reason Russia's going after it is because they're impacting their ability to make things, particularly weapons and defense and ammunitions. So when we think about the world where we're going to the energy transition, can you make weapons? Can you make ammunition? Can you make stuff with wind and solar? And the answer is you really cannot. So you have to be really serious about, is Europe and the US and these Western countries, we need the ability to actually make things. We do not have enough ammunition as it is now. We're making it like crazy and we're sending it over to Ukraine, but we are low on ammunition. So you have oil flowing from Iran to China. You have money flowing back from China to Iran. You have oil flowing from Russia to India, Russia to China. You have all this money going from money. That's our money line and our weapons and our technology line. The red line going from China to Russia. We have all the weapons and technology and drones going from Iran to Russia as well. We have all this oil and coal and grain and everything coming from Russia to China. We have weapons. Again, North Korea and China are going, weapons and ammunition and tech are going to Russia. And then we have money, obviously, from China going to Russia as well, paying for all this stuff. We have all this wind, solar power, wind turbines, we have batteries, and we have solar power and EVs from China that are going to Europe, and money from Europe going to China. So you can see it's nice and really circular. The Saudis are really pretty silent in all of this, yet they're heavily involved. That silence is very interesting right now, especially given how much we know that the Biden administration is talking to them. I mean, right before the war in Israel, we were working out a deal with Saudi Arabia to have a rapprochement with Israel. That was right up before October 7th. Part of why the attacks were as vicious and atrocious as they were was because of this, because they wanted this not to happen. So we've had the Saudi silence. Is India overtaking the Chinese economy? It's definitely growing. It's definitely a long-term thing. It's something that the US and the West would love to see. It's a lot messier than people think. And then North Korea sending all this weapons and tech is a problem. You've got Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, the big three H's. Hezbollah's to your north in Lebanon. Hamas is in Gaza, which we have the current war, and the Houthis in Yemen, which are doing all these attacks in the Red Sea. All those little points, those strike points and things, are where you have attacks, where you actually have wars. The storm clouds over there, the Philippines and Taiwan. So you can see, this is the stuff that Jamie Dimon talks about. And if you ever listen to him, really talk about this stuff. He's saying this and he's hopeful that yes, this all sounds really bad. Hopefully all doesn't happen. But the reality is that if you're a business, if you're a company, you don't have to be thinking about this every single day and it's a doomsday scenario. But you do have to be thinking about and understanding if all this happens or if something happens, how does it impact your business? Not from a 6-month standpoint, but from medium term, but thinking 18 months out, 2 years out, 4 years out, 6 years out. How do you think and what do you do? And that's why this stuff matters. So you can see that this is Iranian crude production in purple and how it came back up. Basically, at 2 million barrels a day of exports to China at $80 a barrel, they're getting nearly $5 billion a month. That allows, you can see that's their exports, that's the money they're getting, that's their revenue that they're getting. That's increased massively. The Biden administration from day one wanted to lift sanctions on Iran. We have sanctions on Iran, we're not enforcing them. So the ramp up in their exports to China increased significantly because they knew this administration was not going to do anything. They knew this administration wanted to play ball. And every time the administration tried to get close and negotiating something, the hardliners did something, including what happened with the hijabs, with the women and women dying in Iran, with all the protests, and then what happened obviously recently. And this hasn't worked for the Biden administration's favor, but in thinking about could oil prices go up, if we have to sanction Iran, if we actually have to cut those barrels from Iran to China and stop that money flow, yes, you would have to see oil prices go up. So more than 20% of global container shipment goes through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, that you can see up through Africa. Suez Canal goes into Europe. A lot of this is really impacting Europe. So don't expect Europe to come away with anything bright from this story because there's nothing good there. The shipping days to go around the Horn of Africa is a lot. I mean, it's basically double your time if you're going to Suez Canal to Europe or you have to go around the Cape of Good Hope through Africa. It's a lot. That's where all of our ships are going. If you are Iranian, if you are a North Korean, if you are a Chinese vessel, the Chinese vessels literally just put a flag there and they say, I am Chinese. They say it over and over and over, so the Houthis know not to attack them. And that's what's happening right now. So if you are any other kind of vessel or you're helping Israel, you are going to get hit and you're going to get attacked. You have to go around. And so it's just increasing the cost for everything. And that's coming at a time when the world can't really afford those cost increases. This is a map of the war in Ukraine. Really important to think about this war. We're more than 2 years on. There is no end in sight. Putin does not want to give this up. This is a very entrenched war. It's very painful, but it's not going away anytime soon, and it is very costly. So that was what the war looked like the first day. And then now, fast forward 2 years plus years, you'll notice that, yes, they've carved out this whole side of Ukraine. So it means that if you're going to have a resolution, there has to be some kind of resolution, meaning Russia would say, we want a chunk of Ukraine no matter what. And is Ukraine going to be okay with that? Probably not. And they've taken this little sliver up north near Kharkiv, which is relatively new. So China, you can follow Institute for Study of War. They're putting out some great maps for that. But when you think about China in just they're funding all of this, but they're heavily entrenched in this. And they're kind of getting away with murder because the G7 is starting to talk about, oh, China, you're bad. You shouldn't, you're funding this stuff, but we're not doing anything about it. And we're going to have to do something about it. If you think of just where China's at, though, that's Japan to the north, you got Taiwan in the middle, Philippines to the south. When you think about Taiwan, it's something we pay lip service to, and people say, oh, it's not going to happen, or yes, it's going to happen if you're really hawkish. you know, it very much is in their strategic calculus. It's kind of that opening to the sea. If you look at that map, that's opening to the sea. But from China's vantage point, this is from the EIA. They actually have a really great profile of the South China Sea. This is their 9-dash line, and it's something that you actually see. It's on Chinese passports. It basically is saying we own the entire waters, right? We own the whole South China Sea. They don't own the whole South China Sea, but that's what they're doing. That's what they're trying to do with the Philippines. That's what they try to do with these islands that they built up from nothing and then they militarized. What they did recently, though, was they added a 10th dash line, and they just went, whoosh, and they just did a little scoop around Taiwan. They put out a new 10th dash line map last year. And so this is the things that, from an escalatory standpoint, it doesn't take much to escalate this, but that's what they want. The International Energy Agency came out and said just this past week, the week before last, with their June annual oil market outlook, they came out and said, okay, all these data points that I'm explaining to you, you can see pretty clearly it's probably the economy that's softening oil demand. But they said oil demand is tempered by the clean energy transition. So remember that the IEA also said we had peaked oil demand in 2019, and then they threw that out with the bathwater, and now they're saying we're peaking. Now, we absolutely may be peaking, but it is not because of the energy transition. It's probably right now, and I don't think it's a real peak, but it's probably more from the economy. And they take that interpretation of the slowing economy, and they fold it into their outlook on EVs and tech, and that's not quite right. That is your oil consumption. So yes, you have these dips, and that goes through 2022. So that's data that was formerly BP that you clean up. So that's oil consumption in orange, oil production in purple. And so next year, demand is always backward looking. So we won't get healthy demand data for 2023 until we're probably in 2025 to really know where we're at. But to tell me that we're going to peak or that we're going to decline or that the International Energy Agency, their IEA net zero means that we have to lose 30 million barrels a day of demand by 2030 or by 2050, and you're just not going to do it. You cannot curb that much oil that quickly. So the U.S. is producing way more than Saudi Arabia. This is not a long-term, this is a long-term problem or a near-term problem. It's not a lasting solution. How long Saudi Arabia is going to let us take market share? We're producing 13.2 million barrels per day. They're producing 9. We're exporting way more than they're exporting. That is a big problem, and it's just something to note. Yes, the industry is doing great. We're doing more with less, but the Saudis probably are not going to let that last forever. Global LNG volumes, the reason I point this out is because that pause in LNG export permits, why that mattered so much, is that LNG is a very new and nascent market, right? That top line tells you is 52 billion cubic feet per day. And that's 52 billion cubic feet per day out of a 400 billion cubic feet per day global market. So we produce over 100 BCF a day. The market is producing and consuming globally 400 BCF a day. We produce more than a quarter of it. And the little LNG market is 52 BCF a day. It's a growing nascent market. And as you know, natural gas, you have to pipeline it, you have to compress it, it goes from a gas, then you have to turn it to a liquid, then you have to turn it back into a gas if you do LNG. It is not easy to ship on a tanker or put it on a rail car like oil, like coal, like put it in a truck. So it's hard. And so when we say, it's really, really important, you have to develop this market for it to exist. And every molecule that we put on the water, we lower the price of spot. We take global security for energy and we just raise it. For every molecule that we put on the water, we are changing the world and allowing people to access energy more freely and not be subject to, say, Russia or wherever they're beholden to their natural gas because they're beholden to it regionally. So putting a pause on future permits matters a whole lot because we're already having trouble building out the infrastructure because we have so much disinformation and misinformation within the market, and it impacts the ability for people to invest. That's your global gas consumption. That's that 400 BCF a day. That's coal consumption. That is basically back to a record high. That is because China is largely using coal. That China coal story, that is never going away. China has a lot of coal. They barely use any natural gas. China's consumption of natural gas is like 30 BCF a day. We produce that in like a heartbeat. We can do that with like a handful of wells. That's what China consumes. That a massive big country, they don't consume natural gas because they don't have it. They're going to be using coal for a very, very long time. And so when you're competing on CO2 emissions, you're just playing whack-a-mole with global CO2 emissions. You're hurting your companies, you're hurting your businesses, and you're allowing China to produce more coal and use more coal, and it's all for naught because it basically benefits China. If you look at where we're actually at for energy, 82% of all of our fuel consumption in the world as of 2022 is traditional energy sources, including oil, natural gas, and coal. Only 7% is renewables, which is wind, solar, and biomass. Now, if it's all about CO2 emissions, here's your CO2 emissions. That is CO2 emissions, so it's basically 40,000 megatons or million tons. And then, so you got the 40,000 there, that's total world. And then these are the top emitters. So you can see China is a lot. They're about that 12,000, a huge amount, and kind of rising. They went down a little bit. Then you see the US, we're on that slow decline, all on the same scale. Total Europe is a little bit below us, and then you see India going up. So that's where we're at in the world. This is why. So if we look at power generation, and I hope by this point you appreciate how important being able to turn your lights on, and just one, to have it to be able to turn your lights on, but two, to be actually to make things, power generation really matters. And now people are taking it seriously because you got tech people saying, oh my gosh, we need power. We have flatlined kind of in power generation, but this is our power generation by source. So we have 4,500 terawatt hours, whereas China has 9,000 terawatt hours. So they have double the power generation we do, and 5,400 of that is coal. 5,400. We don't even have 900. We have a fraction. We have less than a fifth of what they do for coal-fired power generation. So when we are talking about CO2 emissions, we have got to put this into perspective, because they do not have borders, and when you're fighting in states like Colorado has 0.3% of CO2 emissions. So when you are decimating coal towns and you're taking power out of the grid and you're taking reliability for energy out of the grid, you are not changing the world at all. In fact, you're just hurting it. Or you're at least hurting Colorado, and you're hurting those people there. That is Chinese CO2 emissions up. That is U.S. CO2 emissions down. So they're 12,000, and we're down. We went down to 4,000 and change, and we're back up a smidge. But that's really all because of natural gas. And you saw those in previous charts. And then this is a really important story. That's just GDP on the right. That's basically that top line in purple is 12,000 for Chinese per capita GDP, where we're almost 70,000. So we're the only country in the world basically where we can actually raise our GDP and lower our CO2 emissions, and that is basically because of natural gas, case in point, and actually some cleaner coal as well. So lastly, and on the positive story, the resiliency in U.S. shale is really, really impressive. You really do have resiliency in production regardless of price. We've had very high prices as of late, but you can see that whole trend line up, that after COVID, we had volatility in oil prices, and it was a lot of the private companies that really came back in earnest that really drove production back up and activity back up. And it's amazing because the Baker Hughes actually stopped producing, if you guys have paid attention to this. Nobody likes to follow the rig count anymore because they don't think it's relevant. And Baker Hughes maybe got that note because they stopped actually producing their clean data every week. But that's the Baker Hughes rig count in red. And you can see that we have far less rigs than we did pre-COVID, but we actually have 100 less rigs running now than we did last year. So we have less than 600 rigs running right now. We're producing 13.2 million barrels per day. And people are really having a hard time understanding this. How is this possible? And this is why it's so, so important that oil companies talk about this, that service companies, that this information is not in the market. You do not hear this on CNBC, in the Wall Street Journal, on Bloomberg. It's just not there. The reason is because we have these incrementally longer laterals, and so our wells are longer. We need less rigs. Our rigs are incredibly efficient. We can spud to TD a 2-mile-long lateral in days, and do it well and have it in zone, which means we're fracking and we're in zone. And this is really important because people say, oh my gosh, well, we've run out of acreage, right? We don't have the tier 1 acreage is gone, all the core is gone, and we got to be declining. Well, one, that hasn't proven the case because we're at 13.2 million barrels a day. But two, what we saw within COVID and what we saw in the last several years was a lot of these private companies stepping out of that core acreage, especially when natural gas prices were very, very high in 2022. And so you would expect to say, okay, well, our laterals are longer. We've got all these private companies stepping out of the core acreage. We're going to have a material decline in our productivity. This is your productivity, your normalized decline curve for all your basins, for the Permian, for the Bakken, for the Powder, for the Anadarko, and for the Eagle Ford. And you would think, if you were a skeptic, that decline curve should be absolutely smashed. And the fact that it's right in the middle there, even with these 4-mile-long laterals and all this stepping out, really shows that is why we're at 13.2 million barrels per day, because the industry is doing a lot more with a lot less. And really in the past year or so, you have to give a lot of credit to the service companies and a lot of credit to operators just knowing the rock better and being able to frack it really, really well. Incremental knowledge of your rock and your ability to just stay in zone means that frack produces a little bit more. And the fact that we are producing that well out of the toe of those wells is just incredibly, I mean, think sitting here 4 miles from now, we are fracking all the way at that toe and we are getting stuff out. That is very, very impressive. And the fact that we probably aren't getting enough and we can get more means that there's a lot more left to give in that rock. But New Mexico, that is Lee and Eddy County alone, are producing over 2 million barrels a day now. It's just incredible. Everybody's been calling for that New Mexico production to top out a year ago. It didn't. And that just tells you, I mean, the rock is, it's just the gift that keeps on giving. It's thermally mature, it's high pressured, and there's a lot of oil down there. New Mexico, or Texas, 5.6 million barrels per day. What you don't want to do is California and Alaska. These are just declines every month basically because of the regulations in place. Alaska wants to produce more oil, but they can't because of the government, and California does not want to produce more oil, and this is the result. Colorado, we're stuck in this range. We're actually producing about 500,000 barrels per day in Colorado, but we have a regulatory environment that is really, really hard. I just looked at the map for Colorado. We only have one private company drilling right now in Colorado because you've had such an onerous regulatory environment and such massive consolidation that you just don't have any private companies left. And that is why I'm not a big fan of the consolidation, because you do need those private companies in the mix. That is our production in black. That's just perspective. That is our imports in red. That's how much crude oil we import. But you can see our exports in purple, which is over 4 million barrels a day just of crude. So together, when I say we are such a powerhouse and why this is so meaningful for our economy, is that we are exporting all that gray bar. We're exporting about 11 million barrels per day, including refined product, including diesel and gasoline, natural gas liquids, a crap ton of propane, and strictly crude oil. That's our exports of liquefied natural gas. That's in black. That's our pipeline exports in yellow. We're exporting between 12 and 14 billion cubic feet per day of gas. Prices have not been high. We've had warmer weather, and so we're at that capacity. We can export a little more, but we really need to grow that capacity. It's a lot like crude oil. You have to develop the infrastructure. You have to build the export facilities. You have to build the pipelines, and you have to create the market. This is not going to happen overnight, and it's really hard because if you have a regulatory environment that is so anti-oil and gas, it's going to be very, very hard to develop this infrastructure. Whether you develop it or not, the demand for it's going to be there, and it's going to happen at some point. That is our lower 48 rigs, public and private split. Massive, amazing story. Coming off of COVID, publics were ruling everything. Then COVID, the publics were scared to death of doing anything. You had all this ESG and investment pressure, and public companies thought, oh my gosh, all our board members are telling us everybody hates oil. What do we do? Private companies say, I don't care, oil prices are high. I'm going to go drill. That's what they did. And then you've seen that kind of flip as of late. People got their bearings and realized, hey, actually, we are going to be using oil and we make money in oil. This is your public-private companies, private in purple. This is where I say that step out and that stepping out of the core and thinking about the data is really, really important. You can look at this at permits, you can look at this at DUCs, but you can see it really clearly in rigs. The public companies are cored up, they're in the core areas, but you see where all that purple is. It's a really great story because it tells you wherever the purple guys are, wherever the private companies are, they're de-risking that acreage and they're drilling that tier 2, tier 3 stuff that people say is horrible, and it ends up not being that horrible because their returns are pretty damn good. That's your horizontal completions, so that's your total stacked completions. We have not come back to pre-COVID levels. You can see that pretty clearly. We're not completing as many wells. The orange is public, the part of the purple, that's private, oil prices in green, and you can see, and that's the corresponding rig count. And we just haven't come back to where we were. Yet, we have longer laterals. Yet, we have way less rigs, and yet we're producing 13.2 million barrels a day. So the private companies, they came back like crazy, but that's 450 wells on average there, but private companies came back like crazy. Public did not. That is case in point. That is your ESG pressure. That is your investor pressure. That is oil companies not leading when they should, and just not knowing what to do. It looks different in the Permian. This is Permian, same chart, but you can see we're a little above where we were pre-COVID. A lot of this has to do with the private companies and the public companies realizing, hey, we're making a lot of money. That's private companies. The privates really have driven a lot. I mean, they're not every well. Obviously, it's 180 wells we're talking about completions, but it's a lot of activity and growth within the Permian Basin. And you can see the public companies have come back as well, just not quite as many. So the role of the private sector is huge. And I just want to end on this. So I think this is really, really important. U.S. shale is currently hurt more by the lack of conviction from industry leaders and market participants than by potential downside prices in oil. I firmly believe that. Look, and I say this not because you just have to have conviction in your business, but if you aren't talking about it, trust me, no one else is. And people like my voices, people explaining oil and gas in context, it has to be in the market. Because the generalist investor, the retail investor, the broader market, they're still discounting oil because they do not understand the current medium and long-term place it has within the global economy, the U.S. economy, and the stock market. You can't expect the market to solve that for itself. So as public companies, you have to explain to the street what your business is doing and why it's investable and why it is why you need to be in a long-term portfolio. That's not just important for your share price performance, that's important for the entire market to understand so they can know how to invest in you and invest in oil and gas. So that knowledge deficit, it has to be solved for those multiples and that share price performance to be reflective of oil prices and reflective of value. And you see that we see deficits and multiples that just make no sense at $80 oil for some of these public companies. And this is also needed for private companies and for the rest of the industry, basically just to raise capital and do business. But it's so critically important that as public companies, this information gets out because we don't see it in the stock market today. You do not see coverage on CNBC. You do not see coverage on Bloomberg. You don't see it in the Wall Street Journal. You don't see it in the Financial Times. So the only way for that to change is for it to be talked about. So with that, thank you very, very much. And that's it. All right, we got to have some good questions now.
I have one. How does India shape into all this?
From an oil perspective?
Well, I would say oil and geopolitical. Whose side are they going to be on, both economically and militarily?
So we, as the U.S., I can tell you the U.S. is spending a lot of, there's a lot of folks going to India all the time. And there's an interest, I think, by the West to really pull in India. It's not as clean and simple as it looks. I mean, we saw this in the election. Narendra Modi, they thought he was going to win by a landslide. He didn't. And partly that's because the economy is a lot messier than people think. You have very, very high youth unemployment. You have very, very few women actually in the workforce. And so you have a pretty messy, you have a lot of potential. It's technically a democracy. It can be a growing economy. And there's a lot of hope in the West that they are a democracy, right? They're going to grow. Their demographics are way better than China. They're actually growing their population base. They're not declining. So that's a really big story. They consume, roughly 5 million barrels a day crude oil, maybe a little less. So they're not China right now for that story. But they matter a lot in terms of growth story, in terms of where they are geopolitically. But right now, they are keeping the peace, right? They're buying 2 million barrels a day of crude oil from Russia at a discount, and they're just kind of staying silent. So Saudi Arabia and India, two countries that we, as the U.S., we're sending a lot of people over there all the time. We have delegates from India and Saudi coming here. You can go to D.C. and just see it for yourself. You just have to look around and you can see what's happening. So that we're betting on that. It's not super clear, so we definitely hope it goes in that direction. I don't see them aligning themselves with China or Russia. They don't want to be aligned, but they're not comfortable saying, we're completely in bed with the U.S. The problem is these countries also, they trade heavily with China, but they also don't realize that when the chicken comes home to roost, when you go to war, when push comes to shove, like it is with Russia, people can say, we trade so much with China, that's just not going to work out. We just got to keep trading. Well, we're not trading with Russia anymore. So McDonald's is not in Russia. Starbucks is not in Russia. Everybody lost their assets. The airline industry lost $20 billion worth of planes the day Russia invaded Ukraine because all those planes there were seized by Russia. So when war happens, everything changes. And it's reality. And so India they know this stuff well. They deal with China all the time, but we will see when push comes to shove. But expect that space to continue to evolve, and there's a hopeful story that they continue to grow economically, and they're not China, and so they'll come more our way than that way.
Wow, got my head spinning. You talk faster than I can listen.
That's all right. I record it so you can play back on slow speed.
Right, take a breath. It would take me 3 days to ask all the questions I have for you. And because I don't understand why they're pushing electric 18-wheelers and why the truckers are burning diesel instead of converting to natural gas. I'm worried about my grandchildren. The strategic petroleum reserve, you hit on that, but the cobalt reserve is even lower than that. That's a big concern. So my question is, I'm just gonna have one question, very simple, and you answer with 3 or 4 words. Right now today, besides me, what scares you the most?
That's a great question. I don't follow the rules, so I'll use as many words as I like. But no, I think what scares me, it is China. So single biggest thing that's because I spend a lot of time on it, but I also, when you study China and you really, really get deep into the weeds and you really understand how Chinese policy making works, how messy it is, and you start really seeing, and it's hard to figure out motives exactly, but there's way more continuity between Mao to Xi Jinping than anyone knows or realizes. There's only 5 leaders, Mao, Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Zheng Xiaomin, and Xi Jinping. 5. The continuity between them is really dense. So people want to say Xi Jinping is very different. He's not that different than Mao. That is a big problem. The continuity there is really significant. Doesn't mean they have a 100-year marathon strategy. It just means that that's what keeps me up at night. That's the single biggest thing, is that if people did not predict that people didn't predict clearly that we would have the confrontation we do with Russia. I guarantee you we're going to have confrontation with China. It's inevitable. And so that keeps me up at night, in that we have I'm saying this honestly, we have a very soft world. We have kids who have no understanding. We have a society who has no understanding of what China, how entrenched it is within the economy. And that, like I said with Russia, you just don't get to be like, oh my gosh, well, I lost my Starbucks. It's gone. That asset's gone. So if you've got money in China, get it out. If you've got assets in China, get it out. I just listened to, it was Stanley Druckenmiller, big, huge hedge fund investor, multi-billionaire. He was on CNBC several weeks ago, and he said something, and I loved it, because he said, look, they asked him about China, and he said, we haven't been invested in China in 10 years. And he said, for a lot of different reasons. And he says, but as an American, I feel damn good about that. And I thought, that's great. And it's good to have leadership like that. And I don't hear enough leadership in business about stuff like that, of being really clear of how, one, it's okay to, it's not I'm pro-American, I'm anti-Chinese, this is a bad situation. I don't hear enough of that, and I don't hear it in the oil and gas industry. I don't hear, even especially on China. When I hear oil and gas companies dabbling in China, they're trying to, on the refining side, there's lots of things, but it's complex. So that's the single biggest one. But you ask about you mentioned SPR, that will right itself, will have to fix itself. A lot of people say we don't need it because we have so much crude oil. We do need it, if for no other reason. China has one too. But natural gas and diesel, you shouldn't be taking 18-wheelers and making them electric. That makes no sense. And maybe natural gas does make sense, but infrastructure is key. And so really, infrastructure is everything, and it has to make sense. And diesel probably actually makes more sense for the 18-wheeler, especially if diesel prices are depressed. So it's sort of riding and ebbing the flow. And that's why I say all businesses, we tend to, in the oil industry, what we do is we tend to look at this, and I hear this a lot. Oh, well, I don't need to know what oil prices are, because no matter what oil prices are, I have to do my business. Yeah, you say that. But then, but you need to think, how do I feel 6 months? What do I think about my business 6 months from now? If I could get businesses to think a year from now, that would be awesome. But they don't. They think 6 months, they think quarterly. You need to be thinking a year out. You need to be thinking 2 years out. You need to, at the very least, need to have an 18-month plan, and then you need to be thinking 2, 3, 4 years out. So that when all these complexities, if just one of them comes into sight, if one of those black swans swims up to you, that you're not just, you haven't lost it. And it's not that you can prepare for all this stuff. It's that you understand it, and you don't freak out, and you go about your business. And by the way, all these challenges represent massive opportunities, absolutely massive. If you are intelligent and you have capital and you're saving and you know what to do, when we have lower oil prices, lean in, dive in, and go pick up assets, because if you have this amount of uncertainty in oil and gas and we have a dip in prices, that is when I want to be buying.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
You touched on the U.S. production and how we're outpacing the rest of the world. Is that a component of the formations that exist here against the formations that exist in Russia and China, or technology, or a combination of both, or how are we leveraging that? And then second part to that question is, Like, what's the gap, and how worried should we be about that?
It's a really good question. So it's kind of yes and no, and kind of all of the above. So there are the U.S. is unique in that I think we do have very, very good rock, but where you have oil, you're going to find more oil. So Saudi Arabia, they're going after the Jafurah Basin. They have source rock, they have unconventionals, but they don't necessarily. It's taken them a long time, and part of that's because they don't have the unconventional mindset, right? If you have the basic thinking of porosity and permeability, where you stick a straw in the ground and oil comes out, they plug 700 barrel a day wells. We do not plug 700 barrel a day wells here. So it's a completely different mindset. And I've been in Bahrain. I've spent a week with the oil minister when they were dabbling in unconventionals over there. And it really is harder, right? I mean, that's a country that produces 44,000 barrels a day, and they kind of keep it steady. All of these countries in the Middle East could produce unconventional oil, all of them, but they don't have the regulatory environment that we do, right? We don't have a great regulatory environment now, but we have business, we have rule of law, and we can, especially in Texas, you can go drill and complete a well, and we have the infrastructure that can flow. They don't have the same thing, particularly the service sector. And people always talk about this, but the nimbleness of the U.S. service sector is very, very critical. And it's another reason why I say the business has to be very conscious of oil prices and what they're doing and how we go up and down in oil prices, because we don't want to do what we've done in decades past, where oil prices drop, we get rid of the service companies, and then we hurt the business, and then you basically just want to stay steady. If oil prices drop, keep drilling. If oil prices go up, keep drilling. Keep it steady to where that you have those service companies. You do not have that in the Middle East, right? You're basically beholden to Schlumberger or Halliburton. And you don't get the A team, you get the B team or the C team or the D team, because the A team is in the Permian. So you've got those disconnects, and then it's the Middle East. So everybody looks at the Middle East and they just say money. And so consultants screw them over. Now they should not let themselves be screwed over, but they get screwed over. And so they need to be better at it. China has plate tectonics and different geology. They certainly have oil and natural gas. But I do think, studying China, that they're very good at a lot of things. They have not been good at deep water assets. So, they want all the stuff in the South China Sea. They have not been really good at extracting it. And part of that's because, you guys know this, but a frack engineer, you don't go to school to learn how to frack a well. You may do petroleum engineering, but you learn how to frack, and you learn the completions business in the field. And so that learning and that understanding, that iterative process, that is not part of the Chinese mentality. They asking questions and throwing the book out and just saying, let's do it and let's brute force it. That's a little harder, and I think that's kind of hard in the Middle East too. That doesn't mean they don't have the assets, and that doesn't mean they can't, you can't work around this. So in Russia, of all places, Russia's the place that it could have been done. But now all this when they invaded Crimea, they took over Crimea, the sanctions got slapped on, and so then we couldn't help Russia with unconventionals. Russia has the Bazhenov Shale. Russia's producing 11 million barrels a day of crude oil and not even blinking, and they're in a war, and they're in wartime. So Russia has the assets, they could produce a lot more, but they would need outside expertise. However, they're pretty nimble and pretty flexible at just doing oil. They know it, so I wouldn't, they're going to need that help they would need that expertise on the unconventional side, but they definitely have the assets. So it's a number of those factors. It's a really, really great question, and it's something that people talked about 10 years in DC, and they're starting to talk about it again.